The steward of a 150-year-old private club on Beacon Hill puts a soft, practiced hand on the arm of a man in a plain wool coat and tells him, kindly, that he must be mistaken about the address. Not because the man was rude. Not because he'd done anything at all. Because he had arrived on foot, in a coat off the rack, with no invitation in his hand and no important face. And the steward, a man who had guarded that door for 47 years, knew, the way he knew his own name, exactly who belonged inside and who did not. The man in the wool coat did not argue. He looked up at the warm windows of the club, at the gold light, and the shapes of people in evening clothes moving behind the glass, and something crossed his face that was almost sadness. Then he said, "You're probably right." And he turned and walked back down the steps into the cold. 1 hour later, he climbed those same steps again. And this time, the entire room rose to its feet when he entered, because the man the steward had turned away at the door was the person the whole evening had been built to honor. He was the keynote. His name was on the program in the center of every table. And a very old, very proud club was about to learn what it had almost thrown away on its own front steps. There is a club on Beacon Hill in Boston called the Ashcroft. It was founded in 1871, and if you have to ask what goes on inside it, you are, by the club's own quiet logic, not the sort of person who would ever need to know. Dark wood the color of old honey. Portraits of dead founders in gilt frames climbing the staircase. Leather chairs worn soft by 4 generations of the same families. A fireplace that had not gone cold, they like to say, in 150 winters. The Ashcroft did not advertise. It did not have a sign. It had a small brass plate beside the door. And if you did not already know what the plate meant, the door was not for you. On this particular Thursday evening in November, the club's great room had been given over to a benefit dinner, the annual gala for something called the Lantern Fund, a foundation that sent kids aging out of foster care to college, kids who had grown up in group homes and on couches and in the back seats of cars, kids who had spent their whole lives standing on the wrong side of doors exactly like the Ashcrofts. There were 300 people in evening clothes. There was a string quartet. There was a podium with a small brass lamp, waiting for the keynote. Everyone was waiting for Marcus Rourke. If you had watched movies in the last 20 years, you knew the name. The quiet one. The reluctant hero. The man who did the hard right thing at the worst possible cost to himself, and who, in real life, was known for almost nothing except being decent. What most people did not know, what the Lantern Fund knew, and was the entire reason he was there, was that Marcus Rourke had spent 4 years of his childhood in the foster system himself. 3 homes. A caseworker who believed in him when the math said not to bother. A single scholarship, decades ago, from a fund a lot like this one, that had been the hinge his whole life turned on. He never talked about it. He had agreed to keynote this one dinner, this once, because the Lantern Fund did now what that scholarship had done for him then, and he owed a debt he could never actually repay, only forward. And on the night he came to pay a little of it, he told his driver to let him out at the bottom of the hill. He wanted to walk up. He wanted to arrive at the Ashcroft the way a kid from a group home would have arrived, on foot, in the cold, in an ordinary coat, looking up at the gold light in the windows and wondering if a place like that could possibly be for someone like him. He got his answer at the door. The steward who turned him away was named Edmund Hale, and to understand what he did that night, you have to understand that he did not do it out of snobbery. He did it out of love, which is harder to forgive and harder to fix, because a wound dressed up as devotion does not know it is a wound. Edmund was 64, and he had worked at the Ashcroft Club for 47 years, which meant the Ashcroft was not his job. It was his life, his history, and, though he would never have used the word, his family. Because Edmund Hale had come to that door the first time at 17, an orphan, a boy with no people and no prospects, taken on as a busboy because an old member had seen something in a kid clearing plates and had said a word to the house committee. The club had raised him. The old members had taught him which fork and how to knot a tie and how to stand in a room and how to be. And when Edmund had no family at Christmas, the club was where he spent it. And when he was sick, the club sent a doctor, and the men in those gilt-framed portraits were, as near as Edmund had ever gotten, his father's. He had given the Ashcroft his entire life, and it had given him, in return, the one thing he had never had before he walked through its door: a place he belonged, a home, a name that meant something inside these walls even if it meant nothing outside them. And now Edmund was 64, and the world was changing in ways he could feel in his bones, and it frightened him more than he ever let show. The old members were dying. Their children did not care about the club the way their fathers had. There was talk on the house committee, Edmund had heard it, of modernizing, of opening up, of dropping the dress code and the guest rules, and the 100 quiet traditions that Edmund had spent 47 years keeping like a flame. To the committee, it was a business decision. To Edmund, it was the slow death of the only family he had ever had, and the erasure of the only place that had ever wanted him. So Edmund guarded the door harder than anyone. Every rule enforced, every tradition upheld, every standard kept, exactly to the letter, because the rules were the club, and the club was his home, and if the rules fell, then his home fell. And Edmund Hale would be, at 64, exactly what he had been at 17. An orphan on the wrong side of a door with no people in the world. That was the fear that put his hand on Marcus Rourke's arm. Not contempt. Terror, wearing the costume of tradition. A man protecting the only thing that ever loved him from a world he was sure had come to take it away. "I'm so sorry, sir," Edmund said gently, and he meant the sorry, which somehow made it worse. "This is a private event this evening, members and invited guests only. I'm afraid I don't have you on the evening's list, and we do ask gentlemen to arrive in black tie. You may have the wrong address. There's a lovely public dining room down on Charles Street I could point you toward." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. He had the invitation in his inside pocket. He had the single sentence in his mouth. And he watched this careful, gentle, frightened old man guarding the door like his whole life depended on it. And Marcus, who had spent 4 years of his childhood being told, in 100 quiet ways, that he had the wrong address, decided not to make him feel like a fool. "You're probably right," Marcus said softly. "Sorry to trouble you." And he turned and walked back down the steps into the cold. He did not go home. But he came very close. He walked down the hill with his hands in his pockets, and he found a diner 2 blocks away. One of those old ones with a counter and a coffee that never stops coming, and he sat in a booth by the window. And he took the invitation out of his pocket and set it on the table and looked at it. And for a while he genuinely was not sure he was going to go back. Not because he was angry, he wasn't, but because some old 17-year-old part of him, the part that had stood on a lot of steps looking up at a lot of gold-lit windows, had heard you have the wrong address and believed it. The way you believed the thing you were most afraid was true. And that part of him wanted, badly, to just go home and let the Lantern Fund find another speaker who belonged in rooms like that. He was sitting with that when a girl slid into the booth across the aisle and put her face in her hands and started, very quietly, to cry. She was 17. Her name was Mara. She was wearing a dress that Edmund Hale would have approved of. A dress that had cost more than anything she owned, bought by the Lantern Fund for exactly this evening, because Mara was one of their kids, a scholarship recipient, first in her family to make it to college, invited to the gala as a guest of honor of a different kind. She had grown up in 3 group homes. She had spent an hour inside that beautiful wood-paneled club, standing at the edge of a room full of people in evening clothes who all seemed to know each other, holding a glass of something she was afraid to drink, feeling the old familiar certainty settle over her like a coat. You don't belong here. You have the wrong address. And she had slipped out a side door to breathe and walked until she found a diner. And now she was crying in a booth 2 blocks from a room that had a place card with her name on it. Marcus watched her for a moment. Then he said, gently, across the aisle, "You okay?" Mara wiped her face, embarrassed. "Sorry, yeah, I'm fine." "You don't look fine," Marcus said, not unkindly. "You look like somebody who just walked out of a room that made her feel like she didn't belong in it." Mara went still. "How did you know that?" "Because," Marcus said, and he almost laughed, "I'm sitting in this diner for the exact same reason." And the 2 of them, a 17-year-old scholarship kid and a movie star she did not recognize in his plain wool coat, sat in a Boston diner and talked, the way strangers talk when they've each just been made to feel small. She told him about the group homes, about being the only kid at her college who didn't have a home to go back to for the holidays, about standing at the edge of that beautiful room tonight feeling like an imposter, sure that any second someone would tap her on the shoulder and tell her there'd been a mistake. She had to leave. And Marcus listened the way you listen to someone you've decided deserves to be heard all the way down. Then he told her something true. "I grew up in that system," he said quietly. "Foster homes. 4 years. I know exactly the feeling you're describing. The one where you're waiting to be found out. Here's the thing nobody told me, that I wish somebody had." He leaned forward. "That feeling isn't information. It's just an old alarm going off. The room doesn't get to decide whether you belong in it. You do. You walk back in there and you take up your whole space, Mara, because a place card with your name on it is a fact. And a feeling is just a feeling." Mara looked at him. "Are you going to take your own advice?" Marcus looked down at the invitation on the table, and he started, slowly, to smile the crooked smile. "You know what?" he said. "I think I am." He stood up and put money on the counter for both of them and held out his hand to her. "Come on. Let's go be in the room. Together, nobody's turning either one of us away twice tonight." They walked back up the hill side by side. They came up the Ashcrofts' front steps together at 10 minutes to 8. A 17-year-old in a borrowed dress and a man in a plain wool coat, and Edmund Hale was still at the door, and his face when he saw the man from an hour ago start up his steps again went tight, with the beginning of a very familiar speech. He never got to give it, because the doors opened from the inside, and the director of the Lantern Fund came out onto the step with 2 board members behind her, her face flooding with relief, and she said, loud enough to carry into the foyer and out into the cold, "Mr. Rourke? Oh, thank God, we were starting to worry. Please, please, come in. We're ready for you. Everyone's waiting." And Edmund Hale, one hand still half raised, watched the director of the evening's foundation take the arm of the man he had turned away an hour ago and usher him through the door as the guest of honor. He watched the name land. Rourke. He watched 3 board members fall over themselves. He watched, through the open doors, the great room of 300 people in evening clothes catch sight of the Keynote arriving and begin, table by table, to rise to their feet. And Edmund Hale's hand came down, and the color left his face, and 47 years of certainty about who belonged and who did not came apart on the front steps of the only home he had ever had. He had put his hand on the arm of the man the entire night was for. He had told the Keynote he had the wrong address. Marcus felt him there. And on his way through the door, on the arm of the director, in front of the board in the rising room, Marcus stopped. He turned back to the stricken old steward. And he did not say a word about what had happened an hour ago. He simply put out his hand, the way you do when you're meeting someone, and he said, quietly, "Just for Edmund, Marcus. I don't think we were properly introduced. Would you do me a favor and stay close tonight? I think there's a part of what I'm going to say up there that I'd like you to hear." Then he went in, and the room's standing ovation swallowed him. And Mara, who had walked in beside a stranger and was only now, from the sound of that name, understanding who she'd been crying next to in a diner, stood frozen in the foyer with both hands over her mouth. Marcus Rourke gave a keynote that people at the Lantern Fund still talk about, and he gave it, in part, to two people in that room, a 17-year-old girl at table 9 and a 64-year-old steward standing at the back by the door. He talked about the door. He told them, without a shred of cruelty, without naming him, that he had come up the club steps an hour earlier in the wrong coat and been gently turned away, and that he was grateful for it, genuinely grateful, because it had reminded him, right before he was supposed to stand up and talk about kids who don't belong, exactly what it feels like not to belong. He said the Lantern Fund's whole reason for existing was the 1,000 small doors the world puts in front of a kid who grew up with nothing, and the handful of people at each of those doors who decide, in a single glance, whether to wave the kid through or turn the kid away. He said his entire life had come down to a few people who waved him through when the math said not to bother. Every one of us, he said, is standing at somebody's door. All the time. We just don't always notice we're the one holding it. And he looked, when he said it, at the back of the room, where an old steward stood very still. And the great tragedy is how easy it is to spend a whole life so busy guarding a door that you forget you were once the kid on the wrong side of it, praying somebody would let you in. Mara was crying at table 9. She was not the only one. When it was over and the room was on its feet again, Marcus did not go to the after party or the photographs. He went to find Edmund Hale, and he found him where a man like Edmund would be, in a small pantry off the great hall, alone, sitting on an upturned crate with his head in his hands, because the world he had guarded for 47 years had just watched him nearly throw away the one guest who mattered most. Marcus sat down across from him, on another crate, in his plain wool coat. "I didn't come back here to ruin your night," Marcus said. "I want you to know that first. I could have said who I was on those steps. I didn't. Because I didn't want you to feel the way you feel right now. And I'm sorry you feel it anyway." He paused. A man doesn't guard a door for 47 years the way you guard that one, unless the thing on the other side of it is everything to him. So tell me, what is this place to you, really? And Edmund Hale, who had never told the whole of it to a single living soul, told a movie star in a pantry. He told him about being 17 and orphaned and taken on to clear plates. About the old member who'd spoken a word for him. About Christmases at the club because he had nowhere else. And the men in the portraits who'd been the nearest thing to fathers he ever had. And the simple, world-changing fact that this door, this exact door, was the first door in his whole life that had ever opened for him and let him in and told him he belonged. And he told him about the committee and the talk of modernizing and how every rule he enforced so fiercely was really just a man throwing his whole body against the one door in the world that had ever loved him, trying to keep it from swinging shut and leaving him at 64. Exactly what he'd been at 17. Nobody's. Nowhere's. On the wrong side of it again. "So when you came up those steps tonight," Edmund said, his voice breaking, "on foot, in that coat, no invitation. You looked like the whole world I'm afraid of. The world that doesn't care about any of this. And I couldn't. I had to keep you out, because keeping the door is the only way I know how to keep the home." He looked up, wrecked, and it was you. It was the one man in America who understands exactly what that door meant to me, and I put my hand on his arm and told him he had the wrong address. Marcus did not interrupt. He let it all land. Then he told Edmund something of his own, that he too had spent years building walls to protect the little he had, calling it caution when it was only fear, and that the walls never protected the thing, they only sealed him in alone with the fear of losing it. And then he asked the question he'd come into that pantry to ask. "That old member," Marcus said gently, "the one who spoke a word for a 17-year-old busboy with no people in the world. The one who waved you through the first door that ever opened for you." He leaned forward. "What do you think he'd say if he could see the man you've become, standing at that same door now, turning the 17-year-olds away?" Edmund Hale closed his eyes. That was the beat. The whole thing turned on it. "He'd be ashamed of me," Edmund whispered. "He waved me in. And I've spent 47 years pulling the ladder up behind me and calling it loyalty." "No," Marcus said, standing, and his hand came down on the old man's shoulder. "You've spent 47 years scared. That's different. And it's forgivable, and it's not too late." He nodded toward the great hall. "There's a girl out there named Mara. 17, group homes. Stood in your beautiful room tonight sure she had the wrong address, same as you at that age, same as me. You want to know what this door is for? It's for her. It was always for her. Go be the man who spoke the word." Edmund Hale walked back into the great room, and in front of the board and the last of the lingering 300, he crossed the floor, not to Marcus, to table 9, to a 17-year-old girl in a borrowed dress, and the old steward who had never in 47 years bent to anyone stood before her and said, so the tables around could hear, "Miss. My name is Edmund Hale. I have kept the door of this club for 47 years, and I have never once, until tonight, understood what it was for." His voice was not steady, and he did not try to make it steady. "I owe an apology to Mr. Rourke, and I'll make it, but I owe one to you first, because you're the one this place forgot it was built to welcome. You belong in this room more than any man in a portrait on that staircase. And if it's the last thing I do here, I am going to make sure the next kid who comes up those steps in the wrong coat gets told the truth, that they have exactly the right address." Mara couldn't speak. She just nodded, and cried, and nodded again. And the applause that started then was not led, and did not need to be led, and near the door Marcus Rourke watched an old man become, at 64, the person a stranger had once believed he could be. And then Marcus quietly got his plain wool coat from the rack himself, waving off the attendant, and slipped out the front door into the cold. And was gone down the hill before the room had finished understanding that the best part of the evening had already left. He was always gone before the credit arrived. That was the thing about Marcus. Here's the part the story usually skips. The slow part. The true part. It did not fix the Ashcroft Club overnight, and it did not fix Edmund Hale overnight. Nothing fixes anything overnight. The committee's fight over modernizing got worse before it got better, and for a while, Edmund sat in the middle of it, changed and uncertain, no longer the flamekeeper of the old rules, but not yet sure what he was instead. But some things had started to move that could not be stopped. Edmund stopped guarding the door and started opening it. He was the one, in the end, who stood up at the contentious house meeting, the man everyone expected to defend the old ways to his last breath, and argued that the club would only survive if it stopped being a wall and started being what it had been for one orphaned busboy in 1977. A door that opened for the kid who had nowhere else. He proposed it himself. A partnership between the Ashcroft and the Lantern Fund. Every year, a handful of the fund's kids brought into the club, not as a photo op, but properly, mentored, taught which fork, and how to knot a tie, and how to stand in a room. The exact things the old members had once taught a boy clearing plates. Edmund ran it himself for the rest of his years there. He said it was the only work he'd ever done that his old mentor would have recognized as worthy of him. Mara went back to college and did not. From that night, ever again feel like she had the wrong address, because she had learned that the feeling was just an old alarm and not the truth. She graduated. She kept, folded in her wallet, a diner receipt from a booth on Beacon Hill. 4 years later, she came back to the Ashcroft, not up the service stairs, up the front steps, in a dress she'd bought herself, as the youngest board member the Lantern Fund had ever seated. Edmund Hale held the door for her, and this time it was the holding of a door that meant welcome home, and they both knew it, and neither of them said a word, because they didn't have to. Years later, a magazine profiled the club's unlikely reinvention and asked Edmund about the night that turned it. He was quiet a long while. "A man I turned away came back an hour later," he said, "and instead of humiliating me, which I had every bit of coming, he sat down in a pantry and asked me who first opened a door for me. I'd spent 47 years forgetting there was an answer to that question." He smiled. "Every door I've held since, I've held for him, whoever he is that night. Because he's always somebody." Marcus Rourke was asked about it exactly once at a junket for some film. He looked almost puzzled, like he had to reach back for it. Then he shrugged. "He was an orphan who found a home and got scared of losing it," Marcus said. "I've never met anybody I understood faster. He didn't need me to teach him anything. He just needed somebody to remind him he was once the kid on the steps." And he moved on to the next question, because he was, as ever, already gone before the credit arrived. I have told a lot of stories on this channel, but I keep coming back to this one, and I've thought a long time about why, and I don't think it's the reveal. The director throwing the doors open, the name landing, 300 people rising to their feet while the steward's hand comes slowly down. That part's marvelous. I won't pretend it isn't. That's the part we click for. But the part I actually keep is the diner. It's the fact that when he got turned away, he didn't get angry and he didn't pull rank. He got hurt. The old 17-year-old way. And he almost went home. And instead, he sat down across from a crying girl and talked them both back through the door. Two people who'd been made to feel they had the wrong address, giving each other the courage to walk back in. He didn't need to be the Keynote to help her. He helped her when he was still, as far as she knew, just another guy in a diner who'd had a rough night. So here's the question the story left me with, and I don't have a clean answer for it. Almost all of us are guarding a door somewhere. A club, a company, a family, a table, some small circle we finally got let into and are now terrified of losing. And the thing we forget, standing there with our hand half raised, is that we were all once on the steps, in the wrong coat, praying somebody would wave us through. Would I remember that, on a cold night when a stranger came up looking like everything I was afraid of? Honestly, I'm not sure. Most of us aren't sure. And maybe that's the whole thing worth carrying down the hill, that the door was never ours to guard. It was only ever ours to open. This story is fictional, inspired by the quiet kind of decency the best people are known for, the kind that would rather sit in a diner with a stranger than punish the man who turned him away. If it got to you, do me a favor down in the comments. Don't just say great story. Tell me about a door someone once opened for you, the person who waved you through when they didn't have to. I read every one. They're the best part of this. And if you know someone who's been made to feel like they have the wrong address, send them this. It might be the exact thing they need to hear today. If you're new here, subscribe. There's another story coming, and I'd be glad to have you for it. See you in the next one.